Hello, how you doing? It's Phil Thatch, and last Saturday I released a video talking about the 200 to 800 millimeter Canon lens and how I didn't exactly recommend it for use on the Canon R7 because the Canon R7 has such high pixel density, and the 200 to 800 maybe is a little short on resolving power for a lens with that much pixel density. And I'll put a link to that video at the end of this one. And also in that video I talked about how I don't do test charts. I just go out and take pictures of birds or whatever my subject for the day is and figure out whether or not I like the lens for actual real world use. But I decided, it's been about 24 hours as I make this video since that video's come out, and I've been thinking, you know what, maybe I should point these lenses at some test charts. So Heather found a free test chart online, and she downloaded that and printed it for me, and I taped it on the wall in the house, and I have two studio lights in the corners of this little studio office editing camera storage room. And I took both of those and put bright lights on the test chart. And even then, there wasn't enough light with these small apertures. So I ended up using 800 ISO for all these shots. So we'll have to take that into account. And I shot all of these in RAW, and I shot all of these with the white balance set manually. So there's a little color cast to something later on, and I'll show it to you when that comes up. I used the unforgiving R7 with its incredible pixel density for all of these test chart shots, and I just looked at the center. I didn't worry about the corners. And I used the 100 to 500. I used it wide open at 500 millimeters, and then I put the 1.4 teleconverter on the 100 to 500, and I shot it at 700 millimeters. I did it wide open at f10, and I also took a look at f11 with that. I used my beloved 800 millimeter f11 lens, and there's only one way to shoot it, and that's 800 millimeters f11. So that's the way I shot with this lens. And I also did the 200 to 800 lens, and I shot it at 800 millimeters wide open at f9 and at f10 and at f11. And then I took a look at 700 millimeters, which I ended up actually at 707 millimeters. I did that wide open at f9 and f10 and at f11. And I also tried it at 600 millimeters, f9, f10, and f11. At all of these focal lengths and apertures, I moved the camera forward and backwards to where my test chart, which was printed on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of copy paper, I wanted that test chart to fill the frame. So I had to move the camera back and forth, and I thought it was interesting. The 200 to 800 at 800 millimeters on the 1.6 crop R7, for that to fill the frame, I was 29 feet from the target. But then when I put the 800 f11 on, for that to fill the target, I had to move back 32.5 feet. At 29 feet, the test chart was going off the edges of the frame. So maybe the 200 to 800 is not really 800 millimeters, because like I say, I needed 3.5 feet, 29 versus 32.5, more distance to fill the frame with the 800 f11. To fill the frame on the 100 to 500 with no teleconverter, I was at 19 feet. Once I put the 1.4 teleconverter on the 100 to 500 to get 700 millimeters, I was at 27.5 feet. Then when I used the 200 to 800 at 707 millimeters, I was at 26 feet. So that's interesting. The 100 to 500 with the teleconverter is 700 millimeters, and I had to step back to 27.5 feet. And to use this lens at 707, I had to step 1.5 feet closer. Even though I was 7 millimeters more focal range, according to the exit data, I needed to be 1.5 feet closer. So I think this lens might be exaggerating its focal length a little bit. And then to get 600 millimeters with this lens, I was at 22.5 feet. And of course, bear in mind, all of these are on the 1.6 crop Canon R7. So without further ado, let's go look at these boring test charts and maybe figure out something interesting about these lenses. Okay, here are my test chart shots, and I've got the 100 to 500 by itself, the 100 to 500 with a teleconverter at two different apertures, the 800 f11, the 200 to 800 at 800 at 3 different apertures, the 200 to 800 at 707 at 3 different apertures, and the 200 to 800 at 600 millimeters at 3 different apertures. So lots of stuff to compare. I'm not the greatest test chart shooter in the world, so you can see my test chart does kind of move around. Sorry about that. I like shooting birds, not test charts. But anyway, I thought it was interesting that these two shots with the teleconverter, look at the color cast that the teleconverter gives. There's the 100 to 500 without the teleconverter, and here is the 100 to 500 with the teleconverter, and this is with the teleconverter, and then this is the 800 f11. So look how the color changes. No teleconverter, teleconverter. No teleconverter, teleconverter. All these, the white balance is on manual, so the white balance won't change, but it does when you have a color cast from your teleconverter. The other lenses don't have much of a color cast, but that teleconverter sure does. Okay, enough about that. So this is 200%, and this is the 100 to 500 at 500 millimeters wide open at 7.1. At 200%, each pixel that the camera shot is represented by 2 pixels on your screen, so it should definitely not look perfect. But it gives you, with it zoomed into 200%, you can see a little better what's going on, especially if you're watching this on a phone or, you know, a monitor that's not 4K. But there we have it, the 100 to 500. This is what a sharp shot looks like. So let's get ready for some less sharp ones. Here's the 100 to 500 with the teleconverter wide open at f10. And oh man, look at the difference. Pretty sharp, much less sharp. And I've taken some shots with this combination that I've been happy with, but I'm definitely not happy with this test chart shot. So I stopped it down. That's wide open at f10, 700 millimeters. I stopped it down to f11 for this shot, and it definitely helps it some, but definitely not as much as this is the 500 by itself. And there is the f11 version of the teleconverter shot. Now speaking of f11, let's look at the 800 f11. There is the 800 f11. I only have one shot with it because the aperture is not adjustable, and that lens looks pretty good. As a matter of fact, let's compare it to the 100 to 500 with the teleconverter at f11, and I'd say it definitely looks better than the 100 to 500 and the teleconverter wide open at f10. But at f11, other than the color cast, they're pretty close. Maybe the 800 f11 by just a hair. Okay, now we're going to compare the 800 f11 to the 200 to 800, the new lens wide open at f9. So here's the 800 f11, and here is the 200 to 800 wide open at f9, and a blind man could see that the 200 to 800 looks worse. And the 200 to 800, to fill the frame, I was at 29 feet, and the 800 f11 to fill the frame, I was at 32.5 feet. So not only is it sharper compared to wide open on the 200 to 800, the 800 f11 is a longer focal range because it fills the frame more. So there's something to think about. Now let's see if we stop this down. There's the 200 to 800 at f9. There is f10. I think it makes a little bit of an improvement, not huge, but a little bit. And there's f11, it gets back worse again. So if you're shooting at 800 millimeters with the 200 to 800, especially on the unforgiving R7, you want to shoot at f10. All right, now what happens if we're not all the way at 800 millimeters? This is 707 millimeters on the 200 to 800. And I was unable to get it to register 700 millimeters in the exit data. It jumped straight from 672 to 707. So I used 707, and here it is wide open. And here it is at f10. And here it is at f11. And I think it's pretty close at 707 between wide open and f10. F11, it definitely starts falling apart. And I also said, you know what? They don't make a 600 millimeter lens, not a 600 millimeter zoom. Let's try it at 600. So here's 600 wide open. Actually doesn't look too terrible. And there's 600 at f10. and 600 at f11. f11 looks pretty rough. f10 and wide open, I think I might give it to wide open at 600 millimeters. So there you have it. So now let's do some side-by-side comparisons. This is my favorite lens that I call extremely sharp on the left, the 100 to 500 wide open at 7.1. And on the right, it's the 100 to 500 with the teleconverter wide open at f10. Remember, with the 100 to 500, I'm shooting at 19 feet. And with the teleconverter, I'm shooting at 27.5 feet to fill the frame with a sheet of copy paper sized test chart. Definitely sharper without the teleconverter. Here it is stopped down to f11 instead of f10 wide open. It looks better than that. That's on the right we're looking now. This is f10 with the teleconverter wide open, and f11. It's definitely better at f11, but nowhere near as good as the other side. Now we're going to look at the 800 f11, which it just amazes me how good that lens look. And remember, the 800 f11, I am at 32.5 feet. And the 100 to 500 on the left side of your screen, I'm at 19 feet. And it is definitely sharper, the 19-foot 100 to 500 shot, but the 800 f11 doesn't do too bad. Now let's go to the 200 to 800. Here's the 200 to 800. This is a 29-foot shot versus 19 feet. Both lenses wide open. The 100 to 500 blows it away. f10, a little better now, but the 100 to 500 still sharper. Of course, we're shooting from 10 feet further back. And f11, it's softer again. So again, if you're shooting at 800 millimeters with the 200 to 800, you want to shoot at f10. Now we'll look at 707 millimeters versus the 100 to 500. 707 is definitely sharper than 800, wide open, but still nowhere near as sharp as the 100 to 500. Here we are stopped down to f10. That's actually not bad. It's still sharper, the 100 to 500 is, but the differences are becoming less noticeable. And f11, it gets soft again. So f10 is the way to go with this lens. And now we'll look at 600 millimeters versus 500 millimeters. This is 19 feet with the 100 to 500 on the left versus 22.5 feet with the 200 to 800 on the right, both wide open. That's actually pretty good. That's pretty good. I still think the 100 to 500 is a little sharper, but the 200 to 800 does pretty good wide open at 600 millimeters. And here is at f10 at 600 millimeters. I don't know, man. I think it may look better wide open at 600 millimeters. And then f11, it definitely falls apart. So there you have it. Test charts, something I hate to do, but we definitely have learned that at least my copy of the 800 f11 is sharper at 800 millimeters than the new lens at 800 millimeters at any aperture. So I hope that was helpful to you. I hope you got something out of that. What I learned is that this lens is a little better at f10 at 800 millimeters and 707 millimeters, especially 707. It's pretty good at f10 at 707. And then at 600 millimeters, it looks a little better wide open at f9, but it definitely does not look good wide open at f9 at 800 millimeters. And honestly, that's how I've been shooting this lens. I've been taking advantage of the 2/3 of a stop faster aperture, you know, f9 versus f11. That's 2/3 of a stop faster aperture than this lens, but I shouldn't have been doing that. Only 1/3 of a stop faster is the best way to go with this lens, but still, this lens, in my opinion, and according to the test chart shots I just showed you, this lens at 800 millimeters f11 is still a little sharper than this lens at 800 millimeters f10, which is, in my opinion, its sharpest point. And this one has more reach. 800 versus 800 is not the same. And also, because I was so far back, it's not like I was shooting this thing at minimum focus distance at 800 millimeters, where some focus breathing might have robbed it of focal length. I was at 29 feet. 29 feet, I was well beyond. I was nearly 3 times minimum focus distance with this lens. So You know, sometimes when you shoot at minimum focus distance, it'll rob you of some of your focal length, but at 29 feet, that shouldn't be a problem. It's just shorter. This lens is shorter at 800 millimeters than this one is, a little bit. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, take a moment, reach down, hit the thumbs up button. If you want to see some more stuff like this, and hopefully photography of birds instead of test charts, subscribe and hit the bell. And as always, I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye-bye.